may have also had in mind another saying of the Master. In Matthew chapter 12, verse 30, the Master said, "He who is not with me is against me, and he who does not gather with me scatters." Matthew chapter 12, verse 30. On that basis, John and the other disciples may have assumed the unknown exorcist ministry invalid. The exorcist was not with Yeshua because he was not one of the disciples, and anyone not with him is against him. When John reported the encounter to the Master, however, Yeshua surprised the disciples by saying, "Do not hinder him, for there is no one who will perform a miracle in my name and be able soon afterward to speak evil of me. For he who is not against us is for us." Mark chapter 9, verses 39 through 40. The two statements are seemingly incongruous, especially when juxtaposed against each other. He who is not with me is against me, and he who does not gather with me scatters. Matthew chapter 12, verse 30. For he who is not against us is for us. Mark chapter 9, verse 40. The two statements demonstrate the Master's attitudes of inclusion and exclusion. He excludes the Pharisees who are against him in Matthew 12, but includes the unknown exorcist in Mark 9. The criterion which distinguishes the two sayings seems to be that the Pharisees spoke evil against the Master, whereas the unknown exorcist, although not an official follower, spoke in Yeshua's name. The Pharisees criticized Yeshua, saying, "This man cast out demons only by Beelzebul, the ruler of the demons," which was blasphemy against the Holy Spirit, by the way, and always remember that. Matthew chapter 12, verse 24 is one of the unforgivable sins. Whereas the unknown exorcist could not speak evil against him while at the same time employing the authority of his name. Yeshua meant to teach his disciples a level of tolerance toward competing ministries as long as those competitors do not speak against him and his message. The entire story alludes back to the episode of Eldad and Medad, who prophesied in the camp of Israel. John took up the role of Joshua in that story, and the Master echoed Moses' liberal attitude in rejection of territorial competition. Such an attitude of tolerance remains rare among the followers of Yeshua. We would all do well to learn it. Many variations of faith and practice profess the name of Yeshua. Some may even involve dubious miracle working or suspicious theologies. Ours, however, should be an attitude of inclusiveness. Whoever is not against us is for us, and in the end, the coming of the Son of Man will sort the wheat from the tares. In that day, many of us will say, "Master, Master, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name cast out demons, and in your name perform many miracles?" Matthew chapter 7, verse 22. Receiving a disciple. For all who let you drink a cup of water in my name, because you belong to the Messiah, amen, I say to you, he will not lose his reward. Marcos chapter 9, verse 41. On the subject of receiving a child and the lesser disciples, the Master reminded his disciples that every act of hospitality, extended even to the least of his disciples, merited a reward. The gift of a cup of water is a simple act of kindness, the minimum of hospitality. The reward for hosting one of the Master's disciples extends even to the simple act of giving a cup of water to one of the least of his disciples. The Master told his disciples, "Whoever in the name of a disciple, because he is a disciple, gives to one of these little ones even a cup of cold water to drink, truly I say to you, he shall not lose his reward." Matthew chapter 10, verse 42. Contrast that simple act of kindness toward a disciple with the exclusionist scrutiny demonstrated by the John and company regarding the unknown exorcist. The Master is more interested in how his disciples can be good to one another and do good for one another than in the particulars of those things that divide them. The one giving the cup of water does so in the Master's name. The one receiving it is also a disciple, one of the little ones. Likewise, the saying applies to concern for children. One who meets the basic needs of children for the sake of Messiah will not lose his reward for the effort. The millstone, and whoever causes one of the little ones who have faith in me to stumble, it would be better for him to have a millstone hung around his neck and to be thrown into the sea. Marcos chapter 9, verse 42. One who causes a little one who has faith in Yeshua to stumble faces stern punishment in the hereafter. He said to his disciples, "It is inevitable that stumbling blocks come, but woe to him through whom they come. It would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were thrown into the sea, than that he would cause one of these little ones to stumble." Luke chapter 17, verses 1 through 2. An upper millstone weighed several hundred pounds. Incidentally, the archaeologists who uncovered the village of Capernaum found an unusual number of basalt millstones, suggesting that a local industry manufactured millstones. The Master's strong words beg two questions. Who are the little ones who have faith in Yeshua? What does it mean to cause them to stumble? As mentioned above, little ones are literal children, and at the same time, little ones are young novice or lowly disciples. Causing to stumble implies leading a child or a disciple into sin or apostasy, based upon the passages which follows below. The specific type of sin the Master had in mind might have been sexual impropriety of some type, but the warning applies to anyone who causes a child or a disciple to stray from the straight and narrow path. He laments, "Woe to the world because of its stumbling blocks, for it is inevitable that stumbling blocks come, but woe to that man through whom the stumbling block comes." Matthew chapter 18, verse 7. I will add this too. He has it in there. Anyone that kidnaps, and also those that abuse children, they should be killed. And I agree with him, because you destroyed that life at that moment. In other words, the fallen world inevitably offers a constant supply of temptations, but those who victimize and mislead others or intentionally allure others into perverse behavior will face extraordinary repercussions. It is because of these things that the wrath of God will come upon the sons of disobedience. Colossians chapter 3, verse 6. And that's true, and it will come swiftly and fast. Vulnerable disciples can be easily misled into sin and apostasy. Vulnerable children make easy victims, God forbid, for sexual abuse. So the spiritual authorities, clergymen, and religious leaders often find their followers susceptible to spiritual manipulation and sometimes, God forbid, sexual advances. And yes, I've had sexual advances toward me, but I've turned them all away, and I've also cut them off our little spot here on Facebook. Stories of religious leaders who have used their station of spiritual authority, and that's why I don't have a church right now, because it is very hard to run a church, I guarantee you. I've been in them a lot, and I've also been an usher, and sometimes I've been a bishop or whatever you call it. Stories of religious leaders who have used their station of spiritual authority, indulged their flesh, and victimized those that God placed under their care are all too common. And if they're placed under your care and you lead them astray, you better believe you're going to suffer in Gehenna with torment, probably for all eternity, for doing something like that. Men of God easily misuse their trusted reputations to engage in predatory behavior. The Master warned his disciples that punishment in Gehenna awaited such abusers. Yeshua had broader applications than merely sexual improprieties in view. The general principle implies that responsibility for the vulnerable, the adult who causes a child to stumble, will bear the punishment due to the child for the sin. The disciple who causes another follower of the Master to fall into sin will bear the punishment, and that is very true. Where the fire is not quenched, if your hand causes you to stumble, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life and to be an amputee than to have two hands and go to Gehenna, into the fire that is not extinguished, where their worm does not die and their fire is not extinguished. Marcos chapter 9, verses 43 through 44. Continuing his discussion of sin, stumbling blocks, and sexual impropriety, the Master reminded his disciples that it would be better for a man to lose one member of his body than for his entire being to suffer punishment in the unquenchable fire of Gehenna. Likewise, if a disciple causes others to stumble, it is better that he should be cut off from the body of Messiah rather than allowed to continue to victimize others. That's why you read in 1 Corinthians what they did to one guy who was married actually to his own mother, well, stepmother or mother, And they cut him off from the congregation for a whole year and handed him over into the hands of the adversary. If you read it right, that's what actually happened, until he was cleansed spiritually. And then they received him back, forgave him for it, because he quit doing all those things. Yeshua does not advocate literally tying a millstone around the offender's neck and drowning him in Lake Galilee, but he does advocate the severest of possible repercussions for such sin. In classical Jewish interpretation and in the teaching of our Master Yeshua, the final verse of the scroll of Isaiah offers a glimpse into Gehenna, the place of punishment and the afterlife. Then they will go forth and look on the corpses of the men who have transgressed against me, for their worm will not die and their fire will not be quenched, and they will be an abhorrence to all mankind. Isaiah chapter 66 verse 24. And if you just read what I put up on there about these Satan worshipers putting up another statue and everything, worshiping it and all that, they abuse children. And they need to be put down. They need to be saved more than anything, and the children taken away from them. Yeshua quoted the verse from Isaiah 3 times as he warned his disciples about sins committed with hand, foot, or eye. In each case, he declared it preferable to cut off the offending member rather than retain it, sin, and suffer in Gehenna. In no sense should the Master's word be taken too literally imply that a man should maim himself, and that's true. Rabbi Yeshua employs rabbinic hyperbole, typical of the sages, to express the severity of sin, especially sexual sin. Sexual impropriety spiritually damages a man so comparable to the physical damage the body would suffer if a man maimed himself. Consider the following parallel from the Talmud, which seems to echo the words of the Master. The scholar Rabbi Yishmael taught, "You shall not commit adultery," implies you shall not practice masturbation either with hand or with foot. In the case of men, it ought to be cut off. Come and hear what was taught. Rabbi Tarfun said, if his hand fondled his private member, let his hand be cut off below his belly. It is preferable that his hand be cut off than that he should go down into the pit of destruction. B. Nida 13b. The sages of the Talmud argue about whether or not Rabbi Tarfun meant that a man's hand should actually be cut off. They ask, is this rule about cutting off the offending hand meant literally, or is it merely an expression to indicate the severity of the sin? The Talmud concludes that Rabbi Tarfun was serious, yet at the same time, since maiming oneself is an even more serious sin, completely forbidden in Judaism, the saying must be understood merely as an expression to indicate the severity of the sin. So too, we should understand the words of Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Tarfun both in the same sense. Rabbinic hyperbole intended to convey the gravity of sins too easily excused or disregarded. And it must not be disregarded, it must not be excused, because there's no excuse for it. 3 sayings about salt. For everyone will be salted. Marcos chapter 9 verse 49. Mark chapter 9 concludes with 3 separate sayings of the Master involving salt. The first of the 3 forms the natural conclusion to the discussion about Gehenna. But the second and third seem to be disconnected sayings unrelated to the topic of discussion that Mark apprehended to the chapter. In other words, Mark introduced 2 unrelated sayings of Yeshua regarding salt because he had no better place to put them. Number 1, everyone will be salted with fire, and every sacrifice will be salted with salt. 2, salt is good, but if the salt becomes insalty, with what will you make it salty again? 3, have salt in yourselves, and be at peace with one another. Each of the 3 sayings uses salt to symbolize something different, and all 3 clearly belong to different contexts. Mark appears to cluster them together only by way of association. Such associative juxtapositions are typical of rabbinic-style discourse. One need only read a few pages of Talmud to see several examples of this type of transition in subject matter.